I was just talking to our panel here. One of the things that they were saying to me beforehand, that the panelists, was how against tutoring they were. But actually, okay, just as you're coming in, just try and let's shut the doors, please, and then we can at least kill the noise from outside. Sorry, I'm going to just pause for a moment because there's a lot of background noise. Right. Okay, great. Brilliant. We've got some quiet now. Yeah. So they were talking about being very against tuition, but there was a telling thing that one of the panelists said, that applicants from the state system did fine if their parents were well off and they had tuition. And so what we're going to look at now is the reality of this very intimidating test, where you have to be top of the class to stand a chance of getting in. What's involved in taking pretests 11 plus for top London schools? And I've got a really interesting panel to look at that question. So Harry is director of Bonus McFarlane Tuition, and Jason is director of Think Academy. And I'm going to begin, rather than me explaining the differences between these two different companies, I'm going to begin by asking them to tell us a little bit about what Think Academy does and what Bonus McFarlane do. Jason, do you want to kick off?
Hello, everyone. It's always great to be at the May show. It's one of my favorite shows, and I'm the director of Think Academy. Think Academy is a math tuition company. We were founded in 2003, and now we're in 9 different countries, including UK, US, Malaysia, Canada, Australia, Singapore, just to name a few. And we only focus on maths. And in 2018, we became the world's biggest education company, having serviced and helped over 40 million students. And now we're in the UK, focusing specifically on prepping for the 11 plus and the 13 plus exams, as well as GCSE.
Harry?
Hello, I'm Harry. I'm a director at Bonus McFarlane. We are a tutoring provider as well as an educational consultancy. We have around 600 tutors on our books. We broadly support students from 7 plus right the way through degrees. And our consulting arm, again, advises families on how to strategize and support them through making school choices, as well as taking them through UK and US university applications.
Okay, so we're going to start with the really fundamentals questions about the pretest. And apologies if you're very well genned up and you know this already, take a cat nap. Harry, can you tell us about the pretest? What's their purpose? What kind of questions do they ask? And what kind of preparation can you do?
They were introduced ultimately for senior schools to establish what students would be appropriate for their institutions. So ultimately, its purpose is to find out the academic ability of a student applying to that school. To make life slightly easier for them, they made it computerized. And as a result, it's about a 2.5 hour assessment that covers 4 disciplines: English, maths, verbal, and non-verbal reasoning. And that assessment gets sent to the schools of which you apply, and then they can review the results and decide whether they will invite your child for a second round of assessment.
So if anyone went through the UK system sort of 20, 30 years ago, it was all based around an exam called Common Entrance, which was taken literally like at 13 for most senior schools. And the pretests are called pretests because they're pre-Common Entrance. But they've become really important, haven't they?
They've effectively become essential, yes. And what's confusing for some, I guess, is it's sometimes referred to as the 11 plus or the pretest, but sometimes you're applying for a year 9 place. And as Guy said, traditionally, it was that the girls would move for the 11 plus for a year 7 place. The boys would take the 13 plus common entrance in year 8 for a year 9 place. But effectively, that's all been brought forward whether you're a boy or a girl, and that takes place often in the beginning of year 6. So around October, November time. Each school is slightly different. I should say throughout this talk, independent schools by their nature are independent, so they set their own rules and parameters, but broadly, that's when the test is sat. You can only take one assessment per academic year, because there are some secondary schools that will allow you to take the test in year 7, or you might have to retake the test if the school will allow you, but you can only take one per academic year.
And now you'll see, if you sat in both talks, you're going to see some of the value of getting different perspectives. So one of the things that was said in the last talk, when I was asking the question, what age will you know whether your child would suit one of these really academic schools? It was very sort of airily said, well, probably at some point towards the end of year 5, you can work this out. But then, of course, what we're just finding out is that in year 6, literally a few months later, you're going to have to take a really difficult test. So the obvious question is that timeline right? Jason, how much preparation should you be doing? When should you start?
Wow, that's a very big question. And from our perspective, our philosophy is always as early as possible. Now, that's a very vague answer, I understand. But from what we've gathered in terms of learning and our experience with so many students, is that there are broadly speaking, two different types of studying methods. The first one is a more Singaporean, Indian, Pakistani style of studying method, which is basically you, as a year group, you go very far ahead of what you have to learn. Knowledge points are very far ahead of what you have to learn. But actually, per knowledge point, they're quite shallow. They don't go as deep. But if you look at the European style, the British style, the American style, is actually you study what you have to study in each year, but it goes very deep. Each knowledge point goes very deep. Now, the two different styles, both of which are very good, and both of which have different means to help you improve your grades. For example, the Singaporean is to constantly do the same question, same type of question over and over again. A lot of you guys will probably know it's called laundering the questions. It's a very common phrase, and that works. It does really work. The second type is when you understand the knowledge point, you develop interest into the point and grow your sort of logical thinking skills and your understanding skills. That's what you learn in the second way. Both of which are good, but from our perspective, the question laundering method will get you quicker in a very short period of time, but we really don't recommend that. We really recommend starting preparation from a very young age, develop an interest. I think in this talk I'll be focusing on interest far more because interest is so important. Develop an interest in studying maths or other subjects for that matter, and then later on you have a much higher ceiling.
So I think to kind of frame that, I think what you're saying is that if year 5 is actually quite late as a time to be identifying that your child is going down a pretty intense academic route. Would that be right?
Yes, I mean, I've spoken to so many schools and admissions, and they all say, oh, there's no need to prepare that much. Now, that's the advice that they're going to give parents. Yeah. But what we know that we have about 3,000 pupils now studying with us in the UK branch, and from everyone, almost every single person studying with us, the school friends are taking extracurricular, taking extra tuition of some sort during that period of time. So what that basically means, if you really, I'm not going to mention what schools, if you really believe in what the school said, your child will be behind. That's a fact. But unless they're doing, extremely well. If they're doing just okay in the prep school now, and they want to go for one of those highly competitive schools, I think extracurricular is inevitable. Is very straightforward in that case.
Just to get a sense of the room, can you put your hand up if your child is currently in a primary school, a state primary school? Okay, great. And in an independent prep school? Okay, it's about half and half. So just to translate across for the parents in the primary school, years ago I was a senior teacher in a very competitive London prep school. By year 5, we know who's going for the St Paul's, Westminster type schools. I mean, and they're on a different track. I mean, they really are. So the advice being given here for primary, on the previous talk for primary school parents, is frankly wrong. you kind of need to be working this out, I would say, in year 3, I would say, wouldn't you think?
I would say, yeah, certainly be having a conversation in year 3 and then to start that preparation in year 4. Because the reality is, if you're in primary educated, those prep schools, those independent prep schools are probably 6 months to a year ahead of a curriculum. And by their nature, they're prep schools, so they specifically prepare students for those type of assessments. And at a primary school, they won't be focusing on reasoning or have any really identification of the pretest whatsoever. So you would need to receive some outside provision.
Now, one of the things that all the schools say, and some of the test builders, I mean, they're very proud of this, is that they've designed these preparation-proof tests. Frankly, this is absurd. I mean, and anyone who, I don't know how they can spout it.
I think at the beginning it was an unknown, so no one knew about these tests, so you couldn't necessarily tutor for them. But as I'm sure many of you are familiar, there are many now online resources, and so many students are exposed to these types of tests and books, and it's a form of kind of brain training, and quite often students are on these applications every week preparing for these style of assessments. So again, that's the reality of a situation, that they're now no longer unseen assessments. Everyone has had exposure to what they're about.
Yeah. Something that you alluded to there, because obviously we've got half the room are in prep schools. If you're in a kind of competitive London prep school where loads of preparation is already happening, do you need to do anything more?
I think it's mostly about what the parents' goal is, what you want for a child, because we can be very short-sighted in the way that we see the 11 plus as the end goal or as the purpose, but it's not. The 11 plus, 13 plus tests are simply a step in a very, very long journey. The end goal for some might be university, the end goal for some might be employment, but the 11 plus is certainly not the end goal. We feel that, like the two ways that I've mentioned, the question laundering or the ones that you develop interest, we prepare our students into developing interest. We have a course development team from a very young age, from reception, focusing specifically on how to make math questions into a game, make them fun, make them engaging. Because it's very rare we see a child being very interested in something and they're not very good at it. So that's what we're trying to do from the beginning. Say if the maximum score you're getting is 100. We believe that from question laundering, you're trying to get as close to that 100 as possible. But with developing interest, develop your logical thinking skills, your question solving skills, you're not hitting that 100, you're pushing that boundary further, you're pushing the max of your child further, the ceiling is much higher. And that's what we're trying to do. And I think another thing which I do get a lot is that our parents are very, very satisfied with how communication, how well we communicate with our parents, how well our teachers, how often they talk to their parents about how their children are doing. And I think that's key. That's very, very important in the child's progress, to assess how they're doing, to understand the parents' need, to understand the child's needs. And then you move forward from there. And then so it doesn't really burn out from a very young age.
I mean, there's an interesting thing with tuition, isn't there, that if you ask parents in Britain why they tutor their children, it's generally to make up some sort of shortfall or perceived shortcoming. But actually, if you think of other areas of life, like music or sport, or we know that if you're really good at something, getting expert help, tuition, coaching can make an enormous difference to your performance, and it's very, very true in these at the top end of the London schools as well. That there are a lot of kids, even though they're recruiting from a tiny percentage, there's quite a wide band of kids who could pass the exam. Some will, some won't. And the additional support and preparation makes an enormous difference.
Just on that, obviously the one-to-one support is transformational. And even if you are at a good independent prep school, the value of having an hour or 2 hours a week with a teacher by yourself, has amazing results.
And I mean, bonus and follow often put people with tutors who've been through the same.
Very much so, yeah. I mean, we have a broad range of tutors on our books, but clearly we have a big pool that specifically work with students through the 11 plus, and many of those tutors have been through a similar process themselves. And as you'll be aware, the pretest is, the first step. There are often second round assessments and interviews, and then the interview obviously plays a big part of the application.
I'm going to ask you, Harry, just a little bit, because I think it's quite relevant to what we were talking about in the first talk as well. Could you tell us a bit about the benefit following assessments? I mean, I think particularly if you're unsure of your child's, where would suit your child, it's a very useful service, isn't it?
It is, yeah. We're very lucky actually to have an independent psychologist. Quite often families will be aware of CAT scores, and again, if you're at independent schools, those scores are shared and discussed about what schools are appropriate. But if you want to dig a little bit deeper, we do more cognitive assessment based work, and that allows us to really understand the student's cognitive profile. So looking at their processing speed, their working memory, how well they manipulate numbers, and then in turn, a list of recommendations are provided, which can be shared with the family and the tutor. And then from our perspective, have a more informative conversation about what schools are appropriate.
And you don't, again, it's a bit like tuition. In the past, people were assessed only if they were exhibiting very obvious problems. But actually, what I think, from what I understand, all students are assessed, aren't they? Or?
Yeah, ideally they're all assessed. Sometimes not as forensically with a psychologist, but certainly going through the key disciplines to understand their potential. Because quite often, if your child's middle of the pack, they might not be identified what their real strengths are, and that can be obviously invaluable to say, actually, you've got a really impressive student here. If we, give them a little bit of one-to-one support, some opportunities could open up.
So far, I think we've made the whole thing sound unbelievably stressful, and we need to detune this. Remember, we were talking about children, and we want them to be enjoying learning and enjoying school. Jason, how do we take the stress out of this?
Well, I think just to. I concur with Harry's point on the assessment. I think the assessment is one of the most important things to do in the journey of getting good results. It makes learning more efficient. You know what you're doing. There's a saying in the art of war that if you know yourself as well as you know your enemy as well as you know yourself, you'll win all the battles. But first, you have to know yourself. You have to understand where you are. It's a bit like a marathon where you don't know how many kilometers you've ran, how fast you're going, where the stops are. And assessing is very important. And if I may just plug, a very cheeky plug in here, when you walk on your way in, you received a leaflet called Top Maths Club. That's a website that we have developed ourselves. All the materials is for free. We have hired teachers from the top schools, the ones that you know, to write the people that's written the pretest before, who's marking the pretest, to write mock exams on that website. You'll find all the resources you need, all the knowledge points you need for the top schools, and we have the not past papers, but questions specifically for each schools on there as well. So scan the QR code, sign up if you want to, and everything you can access for free is nothing more. And in terms of helping releasing the stress, it's about, for example, if my boss from corporate tells me, Jason, you've got to do this, that's a goal. He's given me an OKR, an objective key result, and I have to do it because as an adult, I have to manage my own stress. But a child's mind works differently. We shouldn't set them a goal. You have to go into Eton, you have to get into St. Paul's, you have to do something, you have to get however much in your next test. It's about the process. I think the parents' involvement, the parents' time with the child in enjoying this process together in learning, enjoying this process and get together into the secondary school, because it's already very stressful moving from prep to secondary. And if the parent's not there for the child to take that journey with them, I think it's going to be much, much harder. And we've had many stories about children, having too much pressure, but it's not actually the pressure that's causing them to be upset. It's the fact that they feel alone, they feel lonely in this journey. But if there's someone doing it with them, being with them all the time, helping them with their emotions, that's a much better way. And setting a goal can be setting simply just a goal is very detrimental. It's all about the process in between. At that age, it's all about the process.
Harry, what would you suggest for stress?
I would say that we select our tutors based on their academic ability and their experience of teaching, but also their personality. So to echo what Jason said, when you go through the process, it's about developing a relationship, having a mentor by your side, developing that confidence and helping them through the process. Also managing the expectations of the parents. I guess mainly that's my job. I kind of see myself often as a kind of counsellor for parents going through this journey, and to relieve the anxiety and stress, and then with the form of an assessment, set clear expectations and look at schools that are appropriate for your child, because they're obviously wonderful schools. Some of them are very academic and they're great for the 0.1% of that population. But there are lots of other schools where your child can flourish. And for us, it's about finding the right school where they're kind of top, middle, third, rather than being kind of shoehorned into an academic institution.
Yeah, I mean, most children don't want to disappoint. That's the really key thing. So if your child is stressed, the chances are they're picking it up from you or from, I think I stress my children out. And I think, so when you're going for something difficult, you really want to try for it, but you've also got to be aware at the back of your mind that if it doesn't work, what might follow might be better. I mean, it's so easy to get obsessed with a single goal, and part of the joy of having children is to watch them follow their roots, and every child has different timelines, different abilities that appear at different stages in their lives, and it's very easy to get really fixated on this one particular hurdle, I think.
Yeah, and to echo that, I mean, it is unfair on the boys, Well, no, but in the sense that the boys traditionally took the 13 plus because they mature a little bit later, so they really kick on in year 7 and 8. But the way it now works is that all the students take the test in year 6. So there is a lot of maturity to develop. And as I said, some schools do sit the assessment in year 7, or certainly do second round assessments just to see the student when they're a little bit older and more mature.
Okay, so we've got a good 20 minutes now for questions. So this is a really good opportunity to kind of air all your anxieties and see if we can answer them, help.
Hi, what common mistakes do students make during the entrance exams, and how can they be avoided?
Sure. So the pretest, I should say, is an adaptive assessment. So that means if you get the first 5 questions right, it will take you down a harder path. And obviously, if you get them wrong, you'll get slightly easier questions. So when your child comes out of the assessment and you've asked them how well they've done, and they've said, that was easy, I did really well, you don't know what that means. So the first thing, if they haven't had any exposure to that test, will be that they'll rush through, they'll worry about the timing, and quite often they finish much earlier within the time frame. So that is the kind of obvious mistake that they make at the beginning.
Great. Question down here.
Since we can speak with candor now, my question really is that it seems that we're looking for a silver bullet here, right? I mean, the children are going to school, our children, 35 hours a week. So what is it that 1 hour or 2 hours per week of tutoring can achieve that can't be achieved in a good classroom environment?
I would like to...
Yeah, just before you just think about the maths about this for a moment, because it's interesting. 35 hours a week in school, but how many maths lessons a week are they having? 5 hours. Yeah, 5 hours a week of maths. So actually, an hour a week would be another 20%.
I like to make I'd like to make 3 points on that. The first point is if your child has potential and your child's ceiling is much higher, actually having everyone learning the same curriculum and the same syllabus is actually stomping their growth. So they need to have extracurricular lessons to help them realize their potential. This is one of the things that I often have to explain. If any of the parents find their children are very good at tennis or very good at football, or very good at cricket, rugby, more likely than not, they would have take extracurricular lessons on the tennis, on the rugby, on the football. But if someone finds their child's very good at, very talented in, let's say, maths or sciences, 99% of the parents will think, oh, great.
Yeah.
And that's it. And I think that's something that's quite interesting if you think about it. If your child has the potential to reach a much higher ceiling, why stop there? Why stop there? And by not taking extracurricular lessons, you're limiting their potential to exactly where everyone else is. And that's number one. Number two is if you, like Guy said, if you add up the maths, if it's an hour and a half a week, and like I said, if you start preparing much earlier, for example, some of our parents start preparing at your reception, but the curriculum at reception is very different. It's more games to develop that logical thinking skills, nothing to do with, they're not doing algebra at reception. But much later on, so slowly, those hours really build up. And once they get to that point, it's not just 1 hour a week, it becomes hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours a week. Yeah. And that's the second point.
Some of you may have heard the 10,000 hour rule, that to really get brilliant at something, you have to spend 10,000 hours at it. And that's what happens with top sportsmen, top musicians, they've done a lot of work. 10,000 hours, actually, when you start calculating it, divide by, say, 10 years of your child's life, and it's quite a lot of hours a week. It's way more than 5. And so if you really, really want to get good at something, you've got to put the time in. I'm a sailor. It's time on the water. That's what you have to do. That's how you get really good.
Yeah, and sorry to jump in here, and I would like to use this as an example. When I was 7, my parents really wanted me to play tennis. Like, they really pushed me 2 hours a week on the tennis. But I absolutely hated it at the time. And I said I would do 10 Olympiad math questions every week instead of going to my tennis lesson. And they were like, okay, great, why don't you do that then? And then later on, I was like, oh, okay, I don't really want to do the question, but it's better than the alternative. So I was like, okay. And then actually, when in 2021, after, I think it was just before the Australian Open of 2021, I suddenly finding myself, really watching it, really enjoying it. And I proactively found a coach. I proactively went to lessons. And this was before I had a job, by the way. Before I had a job, I played four times a week and about 2 hours every time. So 8 hours a week all voluntarily. This is the power of interest. And I think this is so important. That's why we're saying, from a young age, develop the interest, not the question laundering style. The interest is so important.
Okay, question over there.
Hello. I want to ask about how different preparing 11 plus vs 13 plus, because I know 11 plus including until key stage 2. But what about 13 plus? Is that including key stage 3 or actually stretch for the key stage 2? I don't know, but it's the same time they take the exam.
Very interesting question. Harry, do you want to?
They do, yeah. So when we're talking about 11 and 13 plus entry points, they all take the Key Stage 2 curriculum, which is formed in the pretest or the 11 plus. Now, often their students are awarded a place in the end of year 6 or in year 7, and some schools require you still to take the 13 plus exams. And they are more traditional assessments. They're paper written. They happen in a week in June. They're more similar or akin to GCSEs, and you take English, maths, science, history, geography, theology, and a language. And they are structured around the Key Stage 3 curriculum, but the examining body is referred to as the ISEB. So if you go onto their website, they have a clear list of the syllabus and the subjects of which you need to sit.
Should we just quickly, while we're on the kind of curriculum and syllabus topic, should we talk about scholarships, academic scholarships, and what they're like?
Academic scholarships are particularly rigorous, and I would say they are a conversation one would have with your headmaster or headmistress. They often take place in the February or March of year 8, and they are looking more at kind of critical thinking and logical thinking skills. They're very different to the 13 plus syllabus, and broadly are very competitive.
I mean, I used to teach those in a prep school, and we'd have, class sizes of about 5 to get students to get top scholarships at St Paul's or Westminster. So if you're doing that from the state system, you're going to need quite a lot of tuition. They're very tricky scholarships.
It's probably helpful. Quite a lot of the senior schools, they do provide some materials and exposure to the style of testing. Because of the way they're structured, I'd highly recommend going on and just looking through the kind of general papers to see what your 13-year-old or...
And they're bending over backwards. As they both said, Adam and Andy said this morning, they are recruiting far more now from the state system. So they want to give scholarships to state school applicants, but they are very, very tricky exams.
Can you tutor for the interview?
Can you tutor for the interviews?
Schools will say you cannot tutor for the interview. I would suggest that, ultimately education starts at home. And therefore, sitting around the table every evening, having conversations about current affairs, students' interests, what they've been up to at school, is ultimately the start of the interview journey. Arguably, it might help if you have a family friend or a godparent to have a conversation with your child so they're familiar with how an interview is structured. But broadly, the interview itself is not a stressful environment. You're not interviewing for MI5. Parents, again, are very anxious because it takes them back to their first job interview or applications they put in for MBAs. It is an interview by a teacher. Teachers enjoy being with children, and therefore they want to get the most out of the students' interests and find out who they are as individuals. What is their character? If they're going to boarding schools, do they have the ability to board? Are they leaders? So there are certain pointers you can give for an interview, but if you are going to tutor for it and say these are the questions that are going to come up, they will often get very unstuck, the student, and interviewers themselves will say, have you been tutored for this interview? And they normally tell the truth.
Yeah, schools don't like that.
I have to agree.
I've got a question here, but I just want to quickly ask a quick strategic question. How many schools, Harry, should you be applying for?
I would recommend between 3 and 5 at most. One has to consider, obviously, there are registrations fees for all of these schools. The good thing about the pretest, as I said, is it's a computerized assessment. That school score will get sent to all the schools you've applied for. So potentially your child won't know actually all of the schools that you've applied to. So if they're not successful with the more academic ones, there's no loss there from a child's perspective. But really, if you've got 2 or 3 by the end, that's where you should be targeting. And obviously one has kind of a reach ambitious school. Then you've got your standard 80% of the time they'll get in. And then you've got what might be received as a backup just in case it doesn't go well on the day for whatever reason.
Next question.
Thank you. I'd like to know your thoughts on what you said earlier in respect of boys doing the 13 plus and girls doing the 11 plus. What advice would you give in terms of whether boys should wait until 13 to do the test or whether they should go for the 11 plus?
Jason, you want to...
No, it's okay. You can.
Okay. Well, I was just saying they all have to take the assessment now for in year 6. But if you feel that your son's not quite ready, then I'd obviously kind of target schools that are less academically selective and then look at the schools that offer the assessment in year 7 prior to taking the 13 plus.
Question. Sorry, I've got the most terrible cough. Hand right back. So could you wait for the mic, please, so we can't hear?
Want some water?
Yes, please.
Just a quick one on the pretest. Can you scrape through the pretest to get to the written examination, or do the schools look at both scores cumulatively?
It's contextualised, and some schools do different things. So again, going back to the independent sector, I don't want to say exactly what each school does. Some of them take that first round of assessment, scrap those scores entirely, and then it's all done on the assessment that the student takes at the school on top of the interview. Other schools will contextualise both test scores, so it really does vary in that perspective.
Can you say what St Paul's girls do?
No.
No. Okay. Thank you.
So I
I mean, you
had a
can
question.
You can,
They are here today.
yeah, and you can ask them, and they will try and answer that question fairly. You have to read between the lines a bit, because they're not entirely straightforward, but they do try and tell you more or less what they do.
The other thing as well, along with the pretest, they also get a reference from the head of your current school. So again, that contextualises things. And quite often, for example, students will have strengths in English over maths and vice versa. And so that will be explained probably in the reference letter to say, actually, you've got a really good mathematician here, but they've only been educated in the UK for 2 years, therefore their English isn't going to be as strong. But that will explain probably the spiky profile.
Do you mind if I ask a follow-up question, which is how different are the second round tests to the pretest, and how much should focus on the second round versus pretest?
Well, I guess you've got to focus on the first thing that's put in front of you. So, target and work on the pretest first. Again, each test is slightly different, depending on what school you've applied to. Some schools continue to do a computerised assessment. Some people do traditional papers in English and maths. Some just do an interview, but within that, they will ask you to maybe do a creative writing piece, do a comprehension. So they vary slightly. Quite often now they do look at the character as a whole, so they like to do some teamwork exercises and challenges within a group to see how they communicate and work together.
And if you want some sort of independent advice, you can obviously come and talk to Harry and his team.
Yeah, our stand's just on the front, actually, as you walk in on the...
It's very school-specific, is what you're saying, I think.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, what about science? So my son loves science and excels in science, but he kind of just tolerates maths and English, finds them boring. Is there any search for science ability in the test, or is it secondary at this stage?
It's secondary, I'm afraid, in the context that they're just assessing on those 4 disciplines that I talked about. But if they get through the second round, then as I said, at the interview, that's when they can really sell themselves. And
is there any point where science becomes important, maybe at a later stage?
Yes. 18. What you're revealing here is the absurdity of the whole thing, which is that you may be a brilliant art historian, you might be a brilliant linguist, you might be a fantastic physicist, and it just happens that you're not particularly brilliant at English and maths, and this system is not going to discover you. And so what's not being judged here is how fantastic your children are. It's just literally assessing their ability to do these tests at this moment, which is how they will weed out the many more applicants they have than places. It's not the same outside London. It's a particular aspect of London independent schools that they are oversubscribed. I mean, we'll be talking about school fees in the next talk, but I mean, obviously with VAT and the birth rate things, demographics are slightly moving in your favour, in that the worst age to be 11 of all was 2 years ago, and it's getting a little bit easier. If you're lucky enough to have a 5-year-old, it's a lot easier, and if you're any younger than that, it'll be even easier still, because there are a chronic shortage of under 5s in London. So a lot of very difficult to get into primary schools are now suddenly got places, haven't they?
They do, yeah. I've got a 3-year-old. So.
But no, it's sad that a lot of brilliant people would not pass the 11+. Einstein probably wouldn't pass the 11+.
Hi, and is there a chance that with doing this tutoring, once they do get into the school, you're kind of setting them up for failure because they've needed that extra help to get in?
That's a very interesting question.
I think this depends on how you look at tutoring. It's about where a lot of times we see competition as those around us, like the 10 people in the same class or the 20 pupils in the same class. But the real competition is not there. The real competition is the wider society. It's people competing for the same university place. It's people competing for the same job at JP Morgan. This type of, or somewhere else, that's the reality. Yes, if a child really is struggling to get into a school, but from somehow just scrape through, they're going to find it very difficult. And that's not the advice that we would give to parents either. It's not the advice saying if you just scrape through with so much help, they're not going to be happy there. That's why, going back to what Harry said, that's why I find the expectations side of things is so important. And understanding the assessment, understanding what your child wants and what he wants, what he or she is interested in, is the most important part. I think is nothing worse than pushing your child into a higher, more difficult, more competitive school, and then later finding out that he or she can't keep up and they're miserable there, and then they're stuck for 3 years or 5 years. So I think that's the key advice, is the expectations and the understanding.
And there's an interesting sifting thing that goes on. That top universities do not want to take all their students from St Paul's and Westminster and Highgate and Southampton, and so it is tougher if you apply from those schools than it is from other schools. So actually, to be the top of a less highly regarded school, it probably stands in quite good stead when they're applying, at 18 plus for university. Again, I hope there's no schools in the room, are there? But, lots of people leave at 16 and go to state schools for precisely the same reason. And there are some really, really good state sixth forms in London that probably up your chances at university.
There's a very interesting proverb that I'd just like to use. It's called, you'd rather be the head of a chicken than the arse of a phoenix. So that's it.
Right, well, on that note, I'm going to say thank you very much to our panel. Let's give them a round of applause.